Hello everybody, it's Mr. Second Amendment, again, broadcasting from the man cave over here, the workbench. And, this video is long overdue, but if you ask any YouTuber, especially the guys who have video blogs and whatnot, basically they'll tell you the same thing, that it kind of depends on the mood or the situation, basically when they decide to do a video. Right now, I've finally decided to get around to it. And basically this video, as you can tell by the title, is regarding the United States Constitution. If you're wondering why you're looking at a disassembled M1 Garand, it's because I'm about to clean it, and I just want to do something productive while I'm going over these points. Kind of spontaneous, busted out the camera. Just kind of want to, just do a mind dump here, a brain dump, and just kind of talk about the Constitution, where it came from, why do we have it, and why does it even matter? And that's like that last question right there. Why does it matter? That's what a lot of people ask, and I would make the argument that it matters very much. And I'll explain why. Probably should have got some notes for this, but I'm just gonna do it because it's the right moment. Like I said, and you know what? Like a lot of my videos, are pretty much like all of my videos. This should have been done a long time ago. It's a long time in the coming. But, better late than never, and the mood is just kind of here. The opportunity is now, and I feel like it's time to talk about it. So, basically, we have to I'm going to get started cleaning here. Maybe I can talk and clean and think at the same time, I'm hoping here. But, maybe I'll just do mindless cleaning. We'll see how good that is. Anyway, less on what I'm already dropping parts. It's not a good sign. There goes the follower rod. Anyway, alright, where does the United States Constitution come from? How did it all start? Well, first we gotta rewind the clock a little bit. Actually, a lot of bit would be the real term here. We've got to turn back the clock to April 19th, 1775. I believe I got that date right. It's actually a pretty cool movie called Early Morning. It has, what's that guy's name from Men in Black? Not Will Smith, the other guy, and The Fugitive. But April Morning, it's kind of like a made-for-TV show, and basically it shows what this event was all about. But if you don't know what I'm talking about, April 19th, 1775 was when we had our first engagements with the Empire of Great Britain. And that was what was called the shot heard round the world. And that was basically, that's actually from a poem by, let's see who can guess the author. But anyway, it was basically referring to the colonists basically actively, openly engaging the British regulars, commanded by, if I remember right, it was under the authority of General Gates, but it was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Smith, if I remember right. And basically, in Concord, the engagement happened at Lexington, but the regulars, there was about 700 of them, were going down to Concord, and basically trying to take the colonists' arms, ammunition, powder storage, anything that could be used in a rebellion against the crown. Why, you ask? Why were they trying to take the guns away? Why were they trying to disarm the citizens? And this will be a topic of further discussion later on in a different video here. But basically, tensions were getting hotter, things were heating up, and the British Crown was afraid of rebellion, rightly so, as history would prove it. But basically, they wanted to put down something before it became a problem. So there was the local town militia of Lexington got together. They said enough is enough. They met on the greens of the common grounds of the town. The British regulars outnumbered them. It was a very quick skirmish. History, we don't know who fired the first shot. I personally think it was probably one of the untrained militiamen, one of the Minutemen, rather than the professional military soldiers of the king. But either way, shot was fired, started the engagement, and that started open, active conflict with Great Britain against the colonials, which we now refer to today as patriots. But, and this is also the subject of another video, I think if we had lost, we would have considered them traitors. Either way, they made it. So active engagement, we were at war with Great Britain. There were some people who were still loyal to the king. There were some people who thought we should have been basically allied with the king and we should stop. We should be, basically great subjects of the crown and not do anything to mess that up. And some people thought we should be our own nation, governed by ourselves. But anyway, in July 4th, 1776, you know that as Independence Day, the day that everyone lights off fireworks. I know that as the day that we made it official to the world, and especially Great Britain, that the shit filter was full. That we were done with being British subjects. We were being mistreated, and in the Declaration of Independence, there is a list of grievances after all the song and dance. And basically, that list of grievances tells everything that the king was doing. One of the huge factors was, one of the biggest things that pissed off our founding fathers and the framers of the Constitution, the original patriots, was there was no representation in the British Parliament. The colonies were being taxed and they were being governed, and they were being, in many people's eyes, abused and basically used because of their profitability and raw goods. They were being used by the British Crown, and things were becoming unreasonable. And actually, you'll see later on in this video, we're going to go over the Bill of Rights. You're going to see a good number of the Bill of Rights, pretty much all of them, are basically there because that's what the British government was doing to our founding fathers, and they wanted to ensure that wasn't going to happen again. But anyway, going back to the Declaration of Independence, we had already been in active engagement and conflict with the British military and the Crown for the past year, a little more than a year. And at the time, the Declaration of Independence kind of went unnoticed. I don't want to say unnoticed, but it kind of went ignored. King George III, who was in charge of the British Empire at the time, he basically said, forget it, let's keep fighting anyway. And they didn't care. They just said, oh, well, look what these guys are doing. When we regain control of the colonies, none of this is going to matter, and all of them are going to hang, pretty much. But the Declaration of Independence became very important later on. At the time, it was kind of ignored. Thomas Jefferson authored it. For the most part, he was one of the principal authors. It was basically laid out, and I think about 25% of it remained after all of our founding fathers went back and forth, cutting out what they didn't want. Jefferson did, and it's ironic if you know the personal history of Jefferson. Slavery was kind of a confliction of his. He was kind of positive, pro, and against slavery. But he put a provision in there against slavery, and he was all upset because some other founding fathers took it out. And Jefferson's argument was that the British Crown had brought slavery, the scourge of slavery, to the colonies. And they took that out because there were some American sympathizers in the British Parliament that would not see it too happy if we're pointing the finger too hard. So anyway, it got cut down a little bit. Man, this video is going to be long. Hopefully you brought some popcorn, because there's a lot going on, such as this M1 getting cleaned slowly. Anyway, so we brought that, and basically that was our proclamation to the world, saying, yes, we belong to be free. It brought some ideas, and one of them was basically that we have unalienable rights, that every man has natural rights, and rights that no other man or government can take away, because they were rights given by to man by his creator. One of such rights, which makes it very controversial, was the right to revolution, in the event that things became so bad that a governing body was no longer acting in interest of the people. And that, even to this day, makes it one of the most controversial but important documents in our history. And if you go to the National Archives in D.C., which I highly recommend, you will see one of these. It's one of the three. They call it a Charters of Freedom, if I remember. I've only been there twice. But anyway, it's one of the three documents you can see in the National Archives. And don't dare bust out a camera. Believe me, I've seen it. Anyway, because it'll affect the documents, and they got all the guards out there. It'll freak out on you. Anyway, man, this is getting off topic. Let me get back on topic here. So let's rewind the clock a little bit. Back September of 1774, if I believe the month is right, that's when the First Continental Congress met, and this is before there was active engagement with the British Army. Rewind the clock a little bit. This is before Lexington and Concord, before April 19th, 1775. This is when the problems started to get bad. This is when things started to get worse. The reasonable voices within the United States, or the colonies, I should say, at that time, reasonable voices of, hey, let's get representation, properly and peacefully giving grievance to the crown. Everything was being unheard of. Then they had the Boston Tea Party, and then actually it's funny how this is named. If I remember right, it was the Coercive Act of 1774. That was basically the crown's punishment to, it was a giant middle finger to Boston for their Tea Party. And I can't believe it was named that. You could never pass a piece of legislation today called the Coercive Act. It would have to be dressed up and called something fun, like the Patriot Act, or something that, oh, there's no way you could ever vote against the Patriot Act, or something like that. Either way, getting off course again. So basically, things were getting pretty bad. Things were starting to get pretty rough. Colonists, what we would now regard as the young Americans, were getting pissed off. And they were having no representation. And basically they met to try to come up with a solution. That was September of 1774. And many would argue, and I would actually agree with this, and even at the time they thought this, Parliament's indifference and ignorance and non-ability to compromise was causing a lot of the problems. And I believe that's true, because basically a lot of people were willing British subjects. They were proud British subjects. They were loyal to the king, and they wanted a peaceful end to this. They didn't, they wanted the abuses to stop. They wanted the conflict and the problems to stop, and they basically were hoping that King George III was going to help things out and kind of smooth it over, say, look, we've been wrong. Let's get you some representation in Parliament. Let's make things better. I'm really sorry. And everyone who knows their history, who should be watching this video right now, knows that didn't happen at all. King George was basically saying, let them eat cake, and kind of taking a quote from Marie Antoinette. But basically he said, forget these people. What we're going to do is we're just going to clamp the press down a little tighter. We're going to bring regulations in. We're going to make things a little tighter. And forget those people, because they are our subjects. That is our colony. Those are our colonies, and they just need the deal. So that's pretty much, things already were going in the wrong direction back from 1774. Then, of course, we had the shot heard around the world, Lexington and Concord, April 1775. About a year later, a little more than a year later, we had the Declaration of Independence, which was ignored at the time, but later on it became something that we look back and realized was very important at the time. So, moving on. We basically have a huge war, and by the skin of our teeth and the help of our allies, such as France, we basically won the war. Lord Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in 1783, and that's also when we got the Treaty of Paris together in 1783, and the war was officially over. And Great Britain was basically wondering what was to become of this uniquely rebellious but American country. And there's a lot of things, and I didn't warn you for this, but there's a lot of context, and there's a lot of, right now you're viewing history. If you read in history books, you're watching this video, you're viewing things through a 21st century eyeglass. And it's kind of hard to take off the 21st century glasses and put on the 18th century glasses and kind of see things how they were back then. If you view things through today's context, things are going to be a little difficult, and it's going to be hard to understand. You have to kind of go back down to that level of thought of how they were thinking back then to fully, truly grasp the gravity of the situation, to understand. That's kind of a side note, and in some of my videos you'll have to put on those 18th century glasses. Anyway, going back to the situation, we won the war, 1783, it's over, and we start our first government, which is, we call it the Articles of Confederation. It was a document called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. And yeah, and Perpetual Union is the odd, awkward last phrase of it. Ben Franklin, who, no, he was not a president. I'm shocked at how many Americans think he was a president just because he's on the $100 bill. Ben Franklin, who was a statesman, he was one of our greatest people going abroad besides Jefferson, trying to get money for the war. Basically, Ben Franklin kind of employed or kind of was behind the Articles of Confederation. And basically, to sum it up, it was pretty much a disaster. And that's an understatement. It was pretty much, it reminds me a lot of the Weimar Republic of Germany after World War I. And if you don't know what that is, then you need to go Wikipedia that right now. But basically, it reminds me a lot of that. Congress was established, but it had almost no power. They could print money, but it was worthless. The states, no longer colonies, they are now states. And when I say states, I'm not referring to the American context of the word states. I am referring to the 18th century and modern international context of the word state, which is basically talking about country. When we say states in an 18th century eyeglass, when we have those contextual glasses on, we are talking about country. You can pretty much interchange state with country. United Countries of America is the best way to think about it in this context. Anyway, the 13 states or countries united by one very extremely weak federal government. It was kind of, it was a shit show, is what it was. And basically, the federal government had no money. Actually, that is one of George Washington's, it's just a favorite simple quote of his, was just simply no money. They didn't have any money. They didn't have the ability to basically collect it all. They weren't getting money. There was some state, I think Georgia was one of them, that wasn't giving any money at all. The states had no obligation to. Any tax money that the federal government got was all just on the goodwill of the states themselves, and it was just kind of a disaster. Each state had their own currency. That was the biggest thing, is money. Each state had their own currency. Inflation was insane. They couldn't pay off. They weren't paying any interest on the international debt, and everything was just absolute, just tragic. It was not working out. So our founding fathers realized this in 1787. This is 4 years after the war, less than 4 years actually. Basically, they decide to set up some type of convention that is to take place in Philadelphia to figure out what the hell are we going to do about the Articles of Confederation, because this is obviously not working. We need to do something. So they get together in Philadelphia. Initially, only 2 states show up. I forgot which ones. And keep in mind, this is May of 1787. Some states initially refused to go. By the end of May, we had about, I think, 7 or 8 states showed up. And all in all, only 12 of the 13 showed up when it was all said and done. But basically, they got together to draft or come up with the framework to the United States, the legal framework of this country. Because Articles of Confederation were not working. And King George and Great Britain and the whole world was watching, and we were basically failing, is what was happening. Slowly dying, disunifying, and basically that was kind of our problem. And now you see, and it's kind of like the term Reconstruction, which is an American historian term. You're going to see that a lot in history books, talking about the Civil War, after the Civil War, getting things together. Well, there's another term you should know. It's called ratification, is when our states were trying to ratify the Constitution of the United States. Now, under the Articles of Confederation, to ratify any document, every single one, it had to be unanimous. Sorry, it had to be unanimous. All 13 states basically had to approve of a new document if anything was going to be accepted, which made the ratification of virtually any document an absolute nightmare, to say the least. But they had originally 9 out of 13, then they got all 13 on board. I think Rhode Island was the last one that basically decided it was good. But going back to the convention itself, there's a lot of going back and forth. George Washington was there. He was kind of fostering over the whole thing. And sometimes there were great moments, sometimes not so much. But eventually something got turned out. But there was an issue on the rise. There was the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. Now, the Federalists, there's really no modern, it's kind of hard to compute like modern political parties, Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals. It doesn't come close to what's going on here. We're talking about ratification, which is basically the birth of our nation. And, in that sense of the word, we can't really come up with something to compute or compare it with. But anyway, the Federalists were basically in favor of the Constitution and a stronger federal government that could bind all of the individual countries and or states, if you want to call it that. I like to call them countries, like I said. Basically, they were in favor of binding all 13 states together. And the Anti-Federalists were more suspicious of this. They had already, felt the impact of what happens when a strong central authority has too much power. They remember what happened with the guy named King George in Great Britain. So they were suspicious, didn't really want it. An example of a Federalist would have been George Washington. A strong Anti-Federalist would have been somebody like Thomas Jefferson. And even then, our founding fathers had, their own disagreements. It's kind of funny to think of it like that. But anyway, the Anti-Federalists by nature were more involved on a individual state level. They didn't really unify as well as the Federalists, who of course were championing for a federal or a unified national system, which basically made them more successful at getting together and organizing. And in the nature of the game, they ended up winning. The Constitution was ratified. And let's talk about basically what influenced the Constitution. What was it? Well, before we get into what it is, we have to realize, again, putting those 18th century glasses on, there was a very huge time for political change back in that era. We just had the Glorious Revolution. We also had it's not the Reformation. That was the religious back past medieval. Why can't I think? Anyway, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, not the Awakening. Why can't I think of it? I'm going to put up a little blurb of it because I'm just losing my mind here. And it brings me to a point. Hoppies. Some people call it hops. Hoppies. I call it hops because Thomas Hobbes, spelled the same way, B-B-E-S. We call him Thomas Hobbes, not hobbies. And maybe that's where I just get that. Maybe that's why I pronounce it hops number 9. But some people call it hoppies, whatever. Anyway, that's a huge side note. We had our founding fathers, getting back on track, we had our founding fathers influenced by basically John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, if you can open up your philosophy of conservative thought textbook, was basically the guy who engineered the social contract idea. And John Locke expanded on that. But that was the contract of, mankind is basically facing what he called aversion. That's the term, aversion, which is man is in the wild, and to escape aversion, which is natural warfare, conflict, violence, death, he will engage in a social contract with a governing body to protect himself, but as part of the compromise, he's going to be a productive member of that society and also submit to the rule of law to that governing body. And then you had people like St. Augustine that took it a whole different level, and that was before his time, where there was the sovereign and whatnot, which is something entirely different. But anyway, going back to John Locke, his actual words were life, liberty, and property. Wait a minute, Mr. Second Amendment, life, liberty, and property? Isn't it life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Sure, that's what it is in our Declaration, but we pretty much plagiarized almost word for word John Locke. And basically the influential thoughts coming out of that time were that there were unalienable natural rights of man. That he had, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you come from a Jeffersonian point of view, man had a huge right to property. Individual property was key in basically the freedoms and individual freedoms being secured in this kind of society. So basically that was huge for the founding fathers. The fact that we're not going to be subjects that don't have any representation and we're just being basically peasants or serfs, just told what to do. We're actually going to have a say, and we're going to have our own representation in our own government. And as Lincoln would later put, when this theory was tested majorly in the 19th century, a government created for the people by the people. And so anyway, I digress, going back down. Let's see, it sets up the three branches of government, and maybe it would be useful in this time to bring up the preamble to the United States Constitution as we're kind of rolling into this topic here. It'd be useful to bring that up. So it says, looking for I must have misplaced something here. And it says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure her blessings of liberty to ourselves, our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. And basically that sets the theme here of what the hell this document is going to be about. So basically that lays out why we're doing the Constitution. It goes over certain things and whatnot. And, let me go through that with you. It sets up the three branches of government. If you look at Article 1 of your Constitution, that's the legislative branch, which is, the two sets of houses or systems, much like English Parliament, actually, which is ironic, but not really considering where it came from. And basically, you have Article 1 of our Constitution sets the legislative branch. And by the way, this is how you take apart an M1 bolt. And Article 2 is the executive branch. Article 3 is the judicial branch. And that is, of course, your executive branch. Your executive himself, or the man in charge of the executive branch, is your commander-in-chief, which right now is President Barack Obama. And that is basically, he's the man that is in charge of the executive branch. They, basically, in a more legal sense, they enforce the law, the judicial branch interprets the law, and the legislative branch makes the law, if you want to kind of break it down very simply. But the legislative branch has, of course, the House and the Senate, which makes Congress. The House, it depends on population. It was eventually capped. And then Senate is 2 representatives from every state. So you have, all your senators and congressmen and whatnot. Judicial, which is ironic. Here's a little side note. If you run for office in the legislative or executive branches, you have to be voted into office by the people, for the people, by the people. You have to be voted in. If you are an official in the judicial branch, let's say the Supreme Court, do you have to be voted in office? And the answer is no. How ironic is it that the safeguard or the highest legal authority in the United States that overrules all state and even appeals courts and circuit courts, how ironic is it that the safeguard of freedom revolves around justices and officials that were never elected by the people? That is ironic, but there was a reason behind it, because if you're going for re-election, you're going to promise certain things to certain people. But if you're a Supreme Court justice that gets recommended by the commander-in-chief, the head of the executive branch, then you are just what he would consider a good pick, and you have no political motives. And if you don't have to worry, it's a lifelong seat too, which is much like a king, like King George. So that is ironic. They're not voted in, and they have a lifelong term on the Supreme Court. And that's very interesting, just because of the fact that, they are our safeguards of our legal system and our freedom, and they set the legal precedents of basically how we operate, and they have life terms. They're not elected. But that's because they don't want to continually worry about re-election and swaying their decision-making based on voting and trying to garner votes. So in a kind of backwards, weird way, that actually makes sense. And it seems they've been working out mostly pretty good. Except when presidents nominate people to the Supreme Court and then they realize they made a major mistake. But you can ask FDR about that one. Anyway, moving along. And put this bolt back together. Alright, so we go past that, and actually going back to the Supreme Court, it's one of the most fascinating branches to me. I'm pushing in that ejector right there, and hopefully it doesn't fly across the bench here. But there is the judicial review, which kind of brings me to checks and balances. Each branch of government has its own way of checking over the other branches, but it also gets checked by all the other branches.